He's been an actor for decades. He's worked with guns for decades. Obviously, something like this has never happened.
From world-renowned actor to criminal defendant, Alec Baldwin will soon stand trial for his role in the deadly Rust movie shooting. As jury selection inches closer, so does the question of Baldwin's testimony.
I think he's going to have trouble not taking the stand.
Entertainment experts say it's a large possibility that Baldwin takes the stand in his own defense.
Sort of unavoidable for a jury to wonder why, for somebody who has been so vocal, who was willing to take to television to tell his story, to now not want to tell his story in front of a jury. It almost could look like he's hiding something.
But will his decades-long career as an award-winning actor play a role in his testimony?
It's certainly possible that he's acting, right? And so perhaps that's even unavoidable to some degree given his training. But I don't think that acting is really necessary to his testimony per se.
And if he does take the stand, what would that look like?
So I think it's going to be very crucial that his legal team prepare him if he does decide to take the stand.
Throughout this all, an overarching question: will Baldwin's status as a celebrity play a part in the case?
There's always going to be somebody that recognizes an A-list celebrity, whether they are a fan or not.
Baldwin's coming trial is set in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the same city where the deadly Rust shooting took place nearly 3 years ago. Baldwin was in town filming a low-budget Western movie called Rust. The cast and crew were using the Bonanza Creek Ranch as their set, but it soon turned into a crime scene.
How's it going, sir? So my understanding, you were in the room when someone was shot?
Holding the gun, yeah.
In between takes, while Baldwin was rehearsing a scene, his Colt .45 handgun went off. The bullet struck both director Joel Souza and cinematographer Halyna Hutchins. Souza's injuries were serious, but not life-threatening. He was treated at a Santa Fe hospital and later released. Hutchins' wounds, however, were much more severe. She was airlifted to a trauma center in Albuquerque, where she later died. Since then, there's been plenty of back and forth in the case, but here's what ultimately ended up happening. Both Baldwin and the movie's armorer, Halyna Gutierrez-Reed, were charged with involuntary manslaughter. Gutierrez-Reed's trial came first, with a verdict handed down back in March.
We find the defendant, Halyna Gutierrez, guilty of involuntary manslaughter as charged in count 1. We find the defendant, Halyna Gutierrez, not guilty of tampering with evidence as charged in count 2.
As part of her trial, Gutierrez-Reed opted not to testify, and now the focus has switched to Baldwin. The question of testimony is one of the first things I asked entertainment attorney Mitra Ahourian. The big question on everyone's mind is whether he will take the stand. What are your thoughts right off the bat with that?
I think he's going to have trouble not taking the stand, and my hope is that he ultimately takes the advice of his counsel in whether that's a good idea or not. And if he does, he's going to need extensive coaching, right? And he's going to need to stick to the script, so to speak. We all saw what happened when he went on ABC and did that interview not long after the shooting, in which he not only denied any culpability, but he made some statements that were inconsistent with previous statements that he had made throughout the investigation. And that was obviously problematic. It also came off as sort of, arrogant for him to go on and, deny any culpability whatsoever and start to blame other people and come up with excuses. So I think it's going to be very crucial that his legal team prepare him if he does decide to take the stand.
The interview Ahourian referred to has now become synonymous with the case against Baldwin. Just months after the shooting, he appeared on Good Morning America with George Stephanopoulos, and Baldwin claimed he never pulled the trigger.
It wasn't in the script for the trigger to be pulled.
Well, the trigger wasn't pulled. I didn't pull the trigger.
So you never pulled the trigger?
No. I would never point a gun at anyone and pull a trigger at them, never.
And it seems like all roads lead back to that Good Morning America interview that you referenced, where he said he never pulled the trigger. And we saw in Halyna Gutierrez-Reed's trial that experts actually testified and said the trigger had to have been pulled in order for the gun to go off. So is it possible, if Baldwin takes the stand, that he kind of recants what he said on Good Morning America?
I think it's possible that he might either clarify or attribute some of the inconsistencies to either shock or remembering things wrong. I mean, he was interviewed just after it had happened. We saw some footage of him being very distressed. It's understandably very upsetting and distressing and shocking for someone to, anytime, you take someone's life, and especially in that circumstance where he had no reason to believe that the gun had a live round in it. He's been an actor for decades. He's worked with guns for decades. Obviously, something like this has never happened. So I think that, it's not uncommon for some statements that are made. I'll say even, I had a car accident the other day and I was trying to remember some things that happened, and I might have been off with some things. And then if I think about it later, maybe it was, that this had happened or that had happened a little bit differently than I remember. So I think it's normal that in the shock of that. But when you have these sort of grand denials, I think that's where he might get into some trouble.
When it comes to the question of whether Baldwin will take the stand, Ahourian says there are several factors to consider. And leading up to the trial, I'm sure that Baldwin's team is really prepping this, obviously together, doing their research, but talking to their client too. So when they're heading into this trial, they're likely going through the pros and cons of him taking the stand. What do you think those might be?
Yeah, I think, like we talked about, the pros are going to be he can address some of those inconsistencies. And again, perhaps finding, reasons why there might have been some inconsistencies, either respect to his memory or his recollection of what happened, in the order of events. But, this could be a con because the prosecutors, we know, are going to heavily attack his credibility. They're going to heavily attack, his statements about having no culpability, about the not pulling the trigger when like you said, there was no way to shoot the gun without pulling a trigger, unless there was some sort of fault with the gun, which may or may not have been the case. We'll find out throughout the course of the trial. But the cons will certainly be that cross-examination that is going to be very aggressive, and he will need to be prepared for that if he does decide to take the stand. Also, although juries are instructed not to take into account whether someone does take the stand or doesn't, plead the fifth, it's not supposed to be something that they take into account when determining guilt or innocence, and they're always instructed not to. But it's sort of unavoidable for a jury to wonder why, for somebody who has been so vocal, who was willing to take to television to tell his story, to now not want to tell his story in front of a jury. It almost could look like he's hiding something.
Here's where the celebrity factor comes in. Baldwin's career started in the early 80s, and since then, he's made a name for himself in the entertainment world as someone who will captivate audiences. He starred in movies like Beetlejuice and The Departed, and even spent years starring on the NBC sitcom 30 Rock. Needless to say, Baldwin has proven he knows how to act. One of the reasons that this case is gaining so much attention is really because Alec Baldwin is connected to it. I mean, he's been a high-profile actor for decades. Many people recognize him, know his name, and he's known as an actor. So that leads into my next question of, let's say Baldwin does take the stand. Is it possible that he's acting rather than telling the truth?
It's certainly possible that he's acting, right? And so perhaps that's even unavoidable to some degree given his training. But I don't think that acting is really necessary to his testimony per se, because I believe that his emotions, surrounding what happened were real. I believe that he truly believes that he's not culpable. So any statements that he makes are going to come off as confident and assured. I also think, what is his expression of remorse is real. I think, maybe the sadness, all of that is real. And so when we talk about, the difference between acting and not acting, actors are perhaps more trained to access some of those emotions. So perhaps he can access the things that he was feeling at that time more readily than an average person. But I think with respect to his testimony itself, if somebody believes what they're saying, you don't really need to act.
So it could go either way. Baldwin could act a bit during his testimony or speak completely from the heart. But either way, there may be some questions from jurors. Do you think that jurors would struggle with this? I mean, likely they're going to know Alec Baldwin. I would assume most of them have either heard his name, watched a movie or TV show. They're familiar with him. So I'm wondering if it would go through their heads. Is he acting? Is this fake? Or do I actually believe what he's saying? Do you think that's at all a possibility?
Absolutely. That is absolutely going through their heads, especially, if they were following the Johnny Depp Amber Heard case, which the whole world was following. So if they were in fact following that question kept coming up. There was talk of some bad acting on Amber Heard's part, some good acting on Johnny Depp's part. So with these higher profile cases, whether an actor is up there performing is a question that's going through every juror's mind. So that's unavoidable to some degree, but we rely on our juries to really distinguish whether someone is lying or telling the truth. That's something that our jurors have to do every time they're serving. With respect to whether someone is being truthful or not, we sort of are able to unconsciously, sense these micro expressions that indicate lying or telling the truth. So the hope is that they will have either some instinct or they'll be able to focus more on the facts that are presented to them.
Ahourian mentioned the Depp versus Heard trial that captivated Law&Crime audiences for weeks in spring of 2022. After their divorce, Amber Heard penned a scathing Washington Post op-ed about her ex-husband, Depp. She accused him of sexual and physical assault. So Depp sued Heard for $50 million in damages for defamation, and Heard countersued for $100 million. What followed were weeks of testimony in the civil trial, with both Depp and Heard taking the stand. In the end, a jury awarded Depp $10 million in compensatory damages and $5 million in punitive damages. Going back to the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, because that was another A-list celebrity trial that, as you said, the world was looking in on. I'm wondering if there are any comparisons here. Obviously, we had a criminal versus civil trial in that case, but could Baldwin's attorneys maybe be looking toward the Depp-Heard case for what they could expect?
I think in terms of, not only the celebrity factor, but, the fan factor, people showing up to the courtroom. I think it's more that that the prosecutors and that the courts need to be prepared for that possibility, something that the courts were not prepared for in Virginia. Everyone was sort of surprised by how fans showed up and how distracting that was, and how there was an additional expense for security and how some procedures had to be put into place. So I think it's really important that we had that case so that we can think about that foresight. We don't get that so much in California. Where I'm from in Los Angeles, there's celebrities that are going to the downtown courthouse all the time, or Santa Monica or Beverly Hills, and that happens more frequently, and we don't really have fans that show up. We'll probably have it, TMZ or some of the reporters that will be there, but it's much more, uncommon to get what we saw in Virginia, and I think that the courts need to be mindful of that.
This is something we've seen multiple times over the years with high-profile trials. In the Depp versus Heard trial, for instance, major lines and crowds formed outside of the courthouse daily. We've also seen lines for courtrooms in other cases, like Gwyneth Paltrow's civil trial last year, as well as the trial of now convicted murderer Alec Murdaugh. So the celebrity factor, what you were just talking about, obviously in California, it's more common, let's say, than it would be in New Mexico. A lot of these people aren't seeing A-list celebrities all the time. So what do you expect with that aspect of things? We talked about fans showing up, but do you expect it to be a circus, so to speak?
Possibly. I think the bigger challenge is going to be what happens in that courtroom, right? So it's one thing to, see a celebrity on TV. A juror might even think they could be entirely impartial to the fact that the person is a celebrity. But there's something about being in the presence of a celebrity that's different. It's fascinating. It's distracting. You can't help but wonder what their lives are like, and in a lot of ways there might be a surprise factor of like, oh, they're just like us, or, oh, they're nothing like us, or, they think they're above the law. There's that element that could be coming in, right? So that's where voir dire is really important. It's going to be really important for both the prosecutor and the defense to ask the right questions to make sure that celebrity factor is accounted for, and to really find a jury who can set that aside to the extent possible.
But before we hear any arguments from either side or any testimony, both sides will have the difficult task of seating a jury. When we're going through jury selection, again, we've talked about this over and over again, that Baldwin is a big name and a recognizable face. So is it likely that most of the jurors would recognize Baldwin, or would that completely strike them from a possibility of serving?
I think that, there's always going to be somebody that recognizes an A-list celebrity, whether they are a fan or not. And there's always going to be people who don't. That surprises me sometimes. I wonder, as my parents are immigrant parents. There's some people whose faces look familiar to them that they might, have seen in movies, but they don't necessarily have an opinion one way or another about who that person is. And that's probably the kind of juror that a prosecutor might want, while the defense might want fans, of course, right? So I think it's possible to get jurors who don't really feel one way or another about Alec Baldwin in particular, but I think it'll be harder to sort of parse out emotions people might have about celebrities, such as, for example, they believe they're above the law, or actually putting them on a pedestal.
When it comes time to arguments and testimony, we have an idea of what angle each side may take. The prosecution alleges Baldwin is guilty of involuntary manslaughter following a history of negligence on the set. Before the deadly shooting, there had been 2 accidental firings of blank rounds, and several crew members had already resigned out of safety concerns. Prosecutors will also probably point to Baldwin's Good Morning America interview when he claimed the trigger was never pulled. As we saw in the state's case against Halyna Gutierrez-Reed, experts say the trigger had to have been pulled for the weapon to fire at all.
Now, we understand from previous testimony that you sent the gun that was being used by Mr. Baldwin to the FBI for testing. Is that correct?
Yes, we did.
And prior to the testing being done with the mallet, were you notified that that testing could potentially result in damage to the gun?
Yes.
And what was the reason that you proceeded with the testing anyway?
We proceeded with the testing because Mr. Baldwin had made statements that he didn't pull the trigger, and I think his exact statement was that the gun just went off. So we needed to figure out how to disprove that theory or that statement, and that was the way that was proposed to us and what the FBI could do.
We're not entirely sure what the defense has up their sleeves, but experts theorize that Baldwin's attorneys will highlight the difference between a movie set and real life. When Baldwin was handed the gun, First Assistant Director David Halls said it was cold, meaning it wasn't loaded. Halls was later charged and pleaded no contest to negligent use of a deadly weapon. So as it turned out, the weapon Halls handed Baldwin had a live round inside, and that's what led to the deadly shooting. But Baldwin's team will probably say he believed the gun was safe. Those are arguments we could expect, but Ahourian says it's possible other areas of Baldwin's life are also included. Really zeroing in on the celebrity factor, do you think that's something that the defense or the prosecution might bring up? Baldwin's history with the law, his status as a celebrity, his past history in movies and TV, is any of that relevant?
Well, on the one hand, if they feel like it's an elephant in the room, I think that, it might be worthwhile to sort of address the idea of acting, or, whether he's acting or whether he's, has years of training behind him and how that might affect his testimony. But again, I really think that's something that should be handled in voir dire. With respect to his acting itself, the fact that he's an actor and his experience, decades of experience, is absolutely relevant. So we would expect that to be brought up and addressed. This is somebody who has worked on other sets that have guns before, right? So he should know how to handle guns. On the one hand, from the defense perspective, he should never have anticipated that there was a live round. So he should have been able to rely on the safety of the set. From the prosecutor's perspective, this is an actor who understands what sets are like, understands that there is gun safety, that there's training, and he should have done the safety training. He should have, checked and double-checked the gun. So there's both sides of that, but his experience as an actor, irrespective of his training, professional training with respect to his skill, is entirely relevant in this circumstance.
It also seems as though prosecutors are going to highlight the acting portion of things, but additionally the fact that he was a producer on the movie. So maybe it's not necessarily the responsibility of an actor to make sure that the gun is 100% safe, but potentially it is the responsibility of the producer to make sure that everything would be safe on the set, because they're kind of overseeing everything and making sure that nothing could go wrong. So could that aspect also play a role?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I think when you have a celebrity trial in somewhere that is not Hollywood, and you may or may not have people on the jury who have worked in film or television. Now, you remember there are people in other states who work in film or television, because it is very common for Hollywood productions to be shot in other states for various reasons. But if you have people who are not familiar with the film industry, there's going to have to be an educational factor. And that educational factor should come from the defense, right? So it shouldn't necessarily come from a New Mexico prosecutor, because that's not their area of expertise. One of the things that needs to be discussed is the distinction between a producer and an executive producer. An executive producer is not on the ground typically. You might have a financier who has an executive producer credit, but are they the ones that are on set responsible for gun safety? No. So when you have an A-list actor, typically, we give executive producer credits because having that is valuable to the production, right? So having the name of a celebrity attached to the production as an executive producer is something that makes the production actually more valuable. So that is common practice. And I think that this distinction between the producers that are on the ground, even though Alec Baldwin was on the ground, he wasn't on the ground as a producer per se. He was on the ground as an actor. And there are, producers that are on the ground that are responsible for things like that. And that is an absolute distinction. We want him to be the scapegoat because we're calling him a producer, and making that distinction that, oh no, even though you were a producer, you should have been responsible for the safety. You were there. That wasn't really his role.
While we can expect to see some new evidence and hear new witness testimony at Baldwin's trial, we know a lot of what to expect. Experts we spoke to say Gutierrez-Reed's trial this spring was almost a roadmap for Baldwin's. They were both charged with involuntary manslaughter, and prosecutors have made similar allegations of negligence against both defendants. All this just means Baldwin and Gutierrez faced the same maximum sentence, 18 months behind bars. This April, that's just what a Santa Fe County judge handed down.
I'm sentencing you to 18 months of incarceration at a New Mexico women's correctional facility. I find that what you did constitutes a serious violent offense. It was committed in a physically violent manner, a fatal gunshot done with your recklessness in the face of knowledge that your acts were reasonably likely to result in serious harm. You were the armorer, the one that stood between a safe weapon and a weapon that could kill someone. You alone turned a safe weapon into a lethal weapon. But for you, Miss Hutchins would be alive, a husband would have his partner, and a little boy would have his mother. Please take her.
We know the possible punishment Baldwin will face, but what about the future of his career? Regardless of what happens, whether he's convicted or acquitted, is it possible that this event could change the trajectory of the future of his career?
I think with respect to Hollywood, everyone understands that it was a grave, tragic error, mistake for a number of reasons, the things that were handled on the set, and that, this could have really happened to any actor. So I think that really the lesson here is not necessarily that Alec Baldwin should never be hired again, that he shouldn't have, any place in Hollywood. The lesson here is that we need better gun safety precautions on set that are more consistent, that are mandated, and that, had we had those things in place, then, we potentially could have avoided this. Now, there is some, perspective that there were some things in place, but they didn't stick to them. But this is something that has certainly generated a conversation that isn't really even about Alec Baldwin. It's about the industry as a whole and safety as a whole. So I think his career will be just fine. He will pay the consequences for what happened, one way or another. And a lot of people actually don't fault him for many reasons. And we also have the armorer who's already been convicted. So, you know, there's already an acknowledgement that there was someone else who was specifically tasked with making sure that the gun was not loaded with live rounds. And I think really, when we're talking about fault, I think people are really turning to her.
Baldwin's trial will begin on Tuesday, July 9th. For complete gavel-to-gavel coverage, subscribe to our YouTube page, where the entire trial will be live streamed. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.